those of you who are new to the program, give you a brief introduction to the rationale of the series. Across the modern world, modern colonial rule has not only devastated the economies and ecologies of non-Western societies, it has dramatically transformed their cultures and traditions in innumerable ways. Yeah. From the replacement of metaphysics and spirituality by historical and political religions, which are all around us today. In fact, that's pretty much in many spaces, that's what's left of religion is historical and political religion. To the emergence of divisive nationalism and nation states, the contemporary world cannot be understood without the profound impact of modern white supremacist colonial rule based on modern ideas of racial and cultural segregation, historical superiority, and the civilizing mission, as well as national competition for global power and progress. Yeah, the two being related to each other. So it's not just about colonialism, it's also about nationalism. And the two are, of course, deeply related to each other. Habib University's Department of Comparative Liberal Studies and the University of Exeter's Institute of Arab and Islamic Studies have launched this fortnightly webinar series to explore not only the radical transformation of regional Islam, as is the case with other religions, of course. This is by no means limited, a phenomenon that is by any means limited to quote unquote Islamic societies. The word Islam used in this particular historical way, as was said several times last season, is itself a product of colonialism. But radical transformation of regional Islam, we just have to use some of these words after marking them in the modern period. During the period of modern apartheid colonial rule, so national imperialisms of the modern period also implied apartheid. Yeah, the two were intimately related to each other, but also the living potentials of the pre-colonial past. So we also had last time investigations of the pre-colonial past, as well as the urgent decolonial question of what is possible today. Yeah, what can we do and how can we live now? And with that brief introduction, I'll hand it over to my colleague, Dr. Sujad Rizvi from the University of Exeter, who will introduce our very distinguished speaker for today. Sujad, over to you.
Thank you, Noman. And I like your use of season. It makes it sound like some sort of virally successful series on Netflix. And I use virally in a very sort of deliberate way. Yeah, and so we'll have, I guess, season 3 and 4 and 5 and continue until people get sick of us. Anyway, thank you. It's a real pleasure to introduce Dr. Samia Khatun, who is a senior lecturer at SOAS for our seminar today. Samia is a historian who, quite an interestingly creative historian, and her book, Australianama, which came out a couple of years or so ago with Hearst, is really a very creative way of looking at the way in which different peoples interact and travel, and ideas and artifacts travel in colonial space and time between South Asia and Australia in particular. And it also has some rather interesting and bold claims to be made about the nature of historical time and historical writing itself. So I'm very much looking forward to her talk today, because precisely of these wider questions which she raises about the nature of time and also the nature of history and how we write history, which I think speaks very clearly to our decolonial intent that Norman and I have, which is not terribly hidden from those who are watching this, and hopefully we'll take this up in the Q&A. So the title of Samia's talk is Colonial Time in Islam, Decolonizing the Temporality of History Writing. So it in very much in clear ways is a continuity in a sense of with some of those methodological issues that she raised in her book. So I guess without further ado, let me pass the mic to Samia. So please, Samia.
Thank you so much, Professor Naqvi and Professor Sajjad, for having me here today. I'm very, very, very excited to begin a conversation that I hope very much is going to go for years, decades, inshallah. The title of my paper, Colonial Time and Islam, Decolonising the Temporality of History Writing, I guess it's an intent for where I'm going with my research as opposed to where I currently am at. This is what I hope to be presenting today is actually a schema for where next, and I really look forward to picking up some of the themes that I explored in my book and actually connecting to what questions I'm asking next and why, and with such amazing minds as the both of you and also your audience at my fingertips, I couldn't help but see this as an opportunity to actually workshop my next project. So that's the sort of spirit I'll be taking it in. So I just wanted to locate myself and where I'm writing from, and I'll just do that by getting the PowerPoint presentation up. This was an amusing meme that I came across today. Faculty trying to finish their courses for January 2021. It is at the moment week 1 of classes at SOAS, and rather than our very amusing dog scholar here who is trying to pretend that they're not in a moment of crisis, I would actually like to situate this paper as written from very much a moment of crisis. So I'd like to actually begin by outlining some thoughts from the Black Lives Matter movement, just so you get a sense of precisely what's at stake for me politically, pedagogically, intellectually, in undertaking the project that I will be talking about today. So in the aftermath of the sadistic murder of George Floyd in the US, when the Black Lives Matter protests erupted in London, it was sort of during the first bewildering wave of the COVID lockdown that the first protest in Hyde Park happened quite near my house, and I went. It was just absolutely packed, and it was one of those instances where no one should have been out protesting, or that was what the media was saying, but many people turned up. At this, recalling this event, Black British feminist thinker Gail Lewis recalled that Hyde Park that day was both a space of grief and hope. And there may be many in this audience who are not familiar with the works of Professor Gail Lewis. She's one of the founders, I would say, of Black British feminism, and has for a lifetime been interjecting into feminist discourse in Britain and overseas. Very distinguished scholar who's, since my quite recent arrival to the UK, has been quite an incredible influence on me. So, as one of the founders of Black British feminism, Gail spoke about the protest at Hyde Park at the launch of a new book titled Revolutionary Feminisms, one of these events that happened on Zoom. For Gail, the protest at Hyde Park in June 2020 was a site of grief because of the decades she had spent protesting against racism. She recalled that her father had protested at the very same site of Hyde Park against the colonial occupation of British Guyana in the Speaker's Corner. So here she was, decades after that, after decades of protesting against police violence, and there she was again protesting. So therein lay the grief. However, Gail recalled that hope, the other side of the coin of this particular moment of crisis we're at, was sparked for her in seeing a young group of hijabi schoolgirls at the protest. These young teenagers were with their families at the protest. Gail recalled that sitting down with their mums and their grandmums, these were young girls who were getting their elders cups of tea and looking after them. And their mothers and their grandmothers were holding these big Black Lives Matter handwritten signs. So in Gail's account, the sight of these young Muslim women and their families induces in her a profound sense of hope, in the sense that there is something emergent coming. We don't know what it is, she says, the hijabi girls in her reading of it were refusing a particular type of enclosure at that Black Lives Matter movement protest. And quoting her, enclosure not just in the jails and the schools and the hospitals and the homes, but enclosure as in the categories through which we are supposed to be known. And these girls were refusing them because these hijabi girls and their mothers didn't fit into the category of Muslims in Britain as they're supposed to be understood. They refuse the category even while they're declaring themselves, says Gail. Now, I want to use this figure of the Muslim woman, as Gail has invoked her, as an entry point into a discussion of the grammars of hope that might structure our imaginations of better futures at this moment of crisis, and particularly thinking from that protest where all these different types of people came together. Now, the act of envisioning better futures at our current moment is one that is an act of straining to see pathways through time into the future, to another moment, to another reality. With Gail seeing the Muslim woman as a figure of hope, I'm interested in what kind of other temporalities and other temporal pathways can such a figure actually bring to a space like Hyde Park, which has this incredible history of protest and envisioning futures. If we actually challenged the ongoing hegemony of colonial time on the human imagination or human imaginations, I guess my question is, what kinds of future horizons could we glimpse? But, you know, before I delve further into temporalities that could be brought to spaces like this, who were those hijabi girls in Hyde Park? Where were those girls from? Who were they? Perhaps they were families who were from the Caribbean, just as Gail Lewis is. Perhaps it was part of Muslim families from the Caribbean, small group of Muslim families from the Caribbean who live in Britain. Perhaps they were Somali. That's a community that's been here since the late 18th century. British shipping industry sort of employed East Africans and South Asians in as cheap labour, or perhaps they were from South Asia. And I can attest that there was certainly an incredibly big presence of South Asians at that Hyde Park protest. What we can be certain of is that the kind of enclosure in the category of Muslim woman that Gail Lewis was referring to is inextricable from the disciplining of the figure of the Muslim into the timeline of colonial modernity. Regardless of where they're from, Caribbean, African nations, South Asia, Middle East, perhaps they have been here for generations, these particular hijabi girls. What we know is that on encounter with modern paradigms of thought, on encounter with modern institutions, these are figures who have been inserted into a very particular way of understanding time, and a very particular way of understanding time structured by what Wael Halak calls the theology of progress, which Professor Naqvi also drew our attention to at the beginning. Now, as someone who does pedagogical work in the gender studies classroom, I teach gender studies. I'm a historian by training, but I teach gender studies. The particular relationship that gender and women have to this theology of progress is the problem that I deal with on a day-to-day basis. The Muslim woman, as this audience would be very aware of, is very much, or the woman is very much a status marker of where a civilization is in the march to progress in colonial temporal thinking. So to disentangle the figure of the Muslim woman from the idea of progress, I see as one that is incredibly potent and important, and hence the query about what kinds of other temporalities might these young women actually bring to this site of protest at Hyde Park. Now, as a professional historian, I can say with some degree of certainty that the history book comprises a key site where narratives of progress are both defined and actually disseminated throughout the colonies. And I'm of course talking about the colonial history book. Now, if I will just go to my slide again. We in South Asian history or South Asian studies are very much used to understanding this particular partition of time that I'm going to be talking about as one that is enacted via texts like James Mill's History of British India. Modernity and its temporal imagination is, of course, underpinned by the tripartite division of time into ancient, medieval and modern. Perhaps it was writers such as Edward Gibbons in the late 18th century who play a very key role in inventing that tripartite division. In the South Asian context, we would all be familiar with this notion that this tripartite division becomes about a division into the temporal eras of the golden age of the Hindus, followed by a period of decay under Muslim rule, followed by the arrival of the British, which is supposed to usher in an enlightened era of prosperity that will somehow go back to this era of this golden era of ancient India. Now, this story that partitions South Asian pasts is one that is, of course, at the absolute basis of communalist narratives or communalist consciousness in South Asia, and also has extraordinary, profound implications for post-colonial nationalisms today, in the sense that, Indian nationalist narratives have very much accepted this tripartite division of time, and will often understand the role of the Indian state or the role of modernity, or modernity will be brought back or brought on by a return to this ancient golden period of Hindu rule, whereas Pakistani narratives also take this tripartite division of time for, they accept the tripartite division, but the valency of what is positive and what is negative is just switched. So this period that through colonial eyes looks like invasion by Muslim foreigners is often seen as the golden period, and the idea being that we must get away as far from the period of Hindu thought and Hindu rule as possible. And yet this incommensurability of these types of thinkings with each other is absolutely inbuilt into both sets of nationalist discourses. And in Bangladesh, the story is a lot more complex, and both these forms of thinking where, which one's the golden period and which one's the period of decay, sort of flip back and forth depending on where on the political spectrum you are, etc. So this tripartite division is one that is, that we're all dealing with in at every single level, not just in the classroom, but in the nationalist discourses across South Asia. Now, of course, the thing to mention is for those hijabi girls that I mentioned at the very beginning, their experience of this division of time in the British context, of course, looks something a little bit different to this. It looks more like this, that larger body of progress narratives that will actually divide races into map races to time, where it's going to be African and Indigenous peoples at first, South Asian and Middle Eastern peoples in the middle somewhere, and white civilization in the at the pinnacle. And of course, when Gail Lewis said, these are young women who are refusing to be boxed, what she's hinting at, of course, is that these are young people who are building solidarities across these particular partitions of temporal imagination that structure race in Britain, and it's in that kind of rejection of this kind of thinking that she sees hope. Now, what I would like to think about today is, if it is history books such as The History of British India by James Mill that instills in us or has given the world these incredibly problematic types of temporal thinking, then the role of the historian today becomes quite a powerful one, in that if history books invented narratives of progress, then history books today can be our spaces where we can invent new modes of temporal thinking. So this is the kind of work that I have been doing in my own work. And as Professor Rizvi mentioned, it's in my text, Australianama, which I will just hold up here in case anyone wants to know what it looks like. What I want to do today is actually talk about what kinds of insights into the temporality of history that I sort of came upon during writing Australianama, and how to actually take that into a project which sets out specifically to construct, reconstruct, recuperate, rethink how temporality in history writing might work. So I'm just going to very briefly, for the next 5 to 10 minutes, give an idea of some of the basic insights that about temporality in history writing that were generated during Australianama. And to do so, I just need to briefly go through the premise of that book. So the writing of this text started in the wake of me finding a particular text in a mosque in the middle of Australia, in a town called Broken Hill, which is on the precipice of the Australian interior, so a desert area. This text had been mislabeled in a number of Australian history books as a Quran, and I turned up and I came looking for the Quran, and it turned out that in English, in handwriting on top of it, it said the Holy Quran. But when I opened the text up, it wasn't a Quran, it was actually a 500-page book of Bangla Sufi poetry. And not only was it a Bangla text that I could read because my mother tongue is Bangla, but it was a history book. It was a history book that was a Qisas al-Anbiya. It was a stories of the prophets text, and it just absolutely, it absorbed me for almost a decade trying to understand the logic of this history book. Now, one of the things I want to draw out is what this text made very clear to me is that it's actually quite tedious in some ways to keep insisting that on the syncretic past of South Asia. Often what post-colonial historians have grappled with is this notion that we would write histories of the past that show that these partitions are colonially invented, etc. However, because this is a Qisas al-Anbiya, it's a stories of the prophets, it's not set in South Asia, it's set somewhere else that is, the history of early Islam. It's never actually telling us anything about South Asia specifically, the apparent content of the book. However, that's not how we should be reading any of these history texts that belong to historiographical traditions in South Asia. Because what is interesting about the text is actually that it does a particular kind of work. It inducts listeners, it inducts audiences into a world where they can actually see along different axes of time. It inducts you into a type of ontology where you're very, very, very comfortable with the existence of multiple temporalities. Now, this is in very stark contrast to the work of, the James Mill version of South Asian pasts that's going to lay the groundwork for what modern history writing actually looks like. Now, before I get into more details about what it means to have ontological plurality or temporal plurality in a text like the Qisas al-Anbiya, I just want to draw attention to the underlying epistemology that structures this kind of history writing. Now, I'm going to do so by just briefly talking about a metaphor and a motif that recurs in this text, and it's of the pen. It's pen metaphors or pen imagery, is very, very much throughout this entire text. And the text begins with this story that, Allah writes the world into existence with a pen, writes into the ethereal tablet what is going to happen, and trees are made, jungles are made, seas, rivers, oceans, etc. Now, following this setup of the making of the world, there's an autobiographical section about the poet Munshi Razaullah, which actually gives us a sort of key into how the epistemology of the text is working. Now, I'm going to attempt to do a little bit of poetry reading, not very long, because I want to, I think the meat of our discussion today will be in the question and answer. So in this autobiographical section, Munshi Razaullah is going to write that his beard comes to him and says, instead of wasting all this time after your father's death, why don't you translate some books into poetry? This is what will set your life on course. And so, of course, Munshi Razaullah replies, I'm very ignorant. In what form or roop will I write poetry? I thought to myself, without Allah, there's no helper. Whatever and whomever searches, to them the protector grants. Placing my faith in this, I jumped into the ocean, tying my garment to my waist. Feeling pearls with my hands, I began to thread a chain. Qasas al-Anbiya is the name I gave to this chain. Now, in my book, what I show is that what he is actually showing us here, what the poet is actually showing us, is a very particular way of relating to knowledge that is quite different to Enlightenment modes of historical production and Enlightenment modes of knowledge production. But at the very outset, when I first read this piece of poetry, the image that I first saw was of the pen. Now, in the English translation that I've given here, it cannot quite recreate why I would see the pen. However, the way that Munshi Razaullah has set the story up, where he has the image of a pen writing the world into existence, and then we get to this imagery of the poet jumping into an ocean and threading pearls. When you read it in the Bangla, if you're not paying attention, or when you read it in the Bangla just as a piece of poetry, what you see is actually the body of the poet becoming a pen dipped in ink, and the lines of poetry or the threads of pearls that he is invoking become the line after line after line of poetry. Now, what's absolutely fascinating is this is I argue in the book anyway, that it's a very dense metaphor. I mean, people would be very familiar with this kind of metaphor for writing Sufi poetry anyway. This is, quite a classic set of imagery from, I guess, Muslim poetry. What we actually get to see here, though, is that the poet becomes a munshi, a man of the pen. Munshi is, of course, a title for a scribe. And in the imagery of the poetry here, you actually get to see him becoming himself. There's actually a performance here that happens of the poet becoming a particular type of subjectivity in relation to this ocean of knowledge from which he is going to thread these pearls. Now, what was absolutely very interesting for me was not only is he actually giving us a clue for how he's writing history here, but for me, what's interesting is, can we actually harness this as an epistemology to start writing history books today? Can we actually, of course, Munshi Razaullah jumped into the ocean to thread together pearls. Can we today actually do the same thing in this larger project, to be writing history books that use other temporalities that are different to progress, that are different to colonial temporality? Now, in many ways, the book is an argument that the book Australianama is an argument that we can, and I perform how we might do that. But just to give you an idea of the kinds of temporal overlaying that this Qisas al-Anbiya does of various different types of chronologies, the story of Adam, for instance, has overlaid onto it the story of Adam as we might know it from Islam, Judaism, and Christianity. It overlays that with the story of Brahma, with the story of Shiva. So there's a way in which whenever these stories are performed, depending on what it is that you are actually seeking to hear, you will hear. So if you are seeking to hear the story of Shiva, if you are seeking to hear the story of Purusha, that's what you will hear. If you're seeking to hear the story of Adam and Adam only, that is what you will hear. There's a particular way in which every single narrative of the prophets plays out that dynamic where the poet has says, what you search for is what you will find. Whomever you will search for is what you will find. That's sort of a thing that comes true in terms of how the poetry is received and understood by audiences. Now, I said that, you know, my project was to see if I could use this epistemology to actually start writing histories. And because I began with the Muslim woman, let me just explain how I used the story of Aisha in the Qisas al-Anbiya to, to do historical research, to actually go about writing a history book. So the story of Aisha in the Qisas al-Anbiya is there's just an excerpt which is about Aisha losing her necklace by the edge of a lake, and she loses her necklace, goes back to her tent, realizes in the middle of the night she's lost her necklace, goes back for it, and even though it's pitch dark, because of the logic, whatever it is you search for, you will find, she does find her necklace. However, when she returns to the tent, the encampment has moved on. Now, reading this particular story about Aisha, I started questioning of my archives. So here I have found this Qisas al-Anbiya in the middle of the Australian desert. Could it have been bought by a Muslim woman who was absolutely entranced by this story of Aisha? Now, asking that question, could it have been a woman? It seems like an impossible question to ask. This is a 19th century text. All the history books say that women are not traveling back and forth across the Indian Ocean in the 19th century. Women are not moving. It's only male mobility that is happening. However, simply asking this question revealed the most incredible amount of evidence to the contrary. What I found was, just asking the question, could it have been a woman, revealed woman after woman after woman. So this is page 1 of the women, I believe, who are coming just from Bengal. This is page 2, and these are just the named women who are arriving in Australian ports, all right? And these are the women who don't have names. They are the ayahs, the various ayahs from Bengal, just in the port of Melbourne. Now, what this was one of many strands of thought that showed me that this mode of researching that was jumping into this ocean to find, jumping into this ocean with a question will actually return for you whatever and whomever it is that you are searching. If you place your faith in this logic, it is actually an incredible, incredible mode of doing historical research. Now, what has happened in the book is the search for precisely who it is that brought the Qisas al-Anbiya to Broken Hill structures the entire text. And what ends up happening over the 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 years that I read this Bangla text is that I got very, very, very good at reading Bangla, which is not it's not because of educational institutions in Australia, but despite them. I left Bangladesh when I was 7 years old, so this was very difficult text for me to read. So about 7 years into struggling with this Qisas al-Anbiya, one day I pick up this book that was on my parents' shelf. It's a memoirs of my great-grandfather, and I'm flicking through it and I realized, oh wow, I can now read contemporary Bangla because I've been struggling with this Qisas al-Anbiya. And on page 15, there's an account of my great-grandfather remembering the very first book that he heard performed, and it's a copy of the Qisas al-Anbiya, the same text that I would find in Broken Hill 150 years later. Now, what ends up happening is I start then realizing, oh my goodness, I've been searching all these years. I've been searching all these years for who brought this text and who brought this set of stories to Broken Hill, whereas it's actually in my own family archive. And then in Australianama, I'm able to then show how, following the story of Yusuf, probably one of the most famous stories from the Qisas al-Anbiya, following the story of Yusuf, I can actually show how these historical narratives were very much alive in my family archive and in the oral archive, particularly of the Zanana, of the Ontor Mohol, of the women's narratives, because what ends up happening is the diffusion of these particular stories of the prophets remains very much alive in these non-official forms of historical storytelling. So I'm able to, in the text, without giving away too much, I'm able to, in Australianama, in some ways perform the same thing that Munshi Razaullah is able to perform in his metaphor for jumping into the ocean and finding Munshi Razaullah, Munshi, the man of the pen, or imaging. That's the image that metaphor gives us. I'm able to do that in the sense that I end up showing that after years and years and years of searching for who brought the stories of the prophets to the middle of Australia, the answer is I brought these stories of the prophets to Broken Hill via my own family archives. Now, I won't labor upon this point too much because I don't want to give away what actually happens inside the book, because I do it in a particular way that you would have to read to see whether or not you're convinced by my argument. But it's a way of, I guess, performing that human subjectivities can be invented in the process of writing new types of history books. So what I'm left with at the end of this project is this performance that I've done that shows that, in the same way that Munshi Razaullah wove together what we might think of as the chronology of Brahma, Purusha, Shiva with the chronologies of the prophets of Islam, with various other different chronologies, and is able to create a subject that is profoundly comfortable with multiplicity of temporalities. Just as he is able to do that today in 2020, 2019, 2018, which is when the book came out, I'm able to weave together narratives and chronologies from Australian Aboriginal temporality, narratives and chronologies from Muslim history, from the Tariq genre of historical storytelling, from the Itihash genre of historical storytelling. I'm able to weave all those together and actually create a whole new type of subjectivity. Now, having written the book, having it circulating out there, my questions now have demanded with more precision that I be able to name what this temporality is that I am actually inhabiting in this text, and this other kind of temporality that we can use to be doing historical writing. And the reason that question of temporality has become far more urgent is because of my setting. I am now in a gender studies classroom where I'm having to teach young people about the fallacies of women and the progress narrative. You can't go into a classroom and take away progress, which operates for many of these young people as a grammar of hope. You actually can't take that away without giving them something else that is a grammar of hope that they can understand and see futures through. It's too easy, or it's easy to go in there and smash progress, but what we actually need is to be able to name what else is there. So my next project, which, I as I said, I hope to be discussing over the next years, maybe decades, with the hosts of this seminar series, focuses in upon various different forms of historical production that has popularly shaped narratives in Bengal. So currently I'm working with the Moymanshing and those are a series of love stories, ballads, which sort of operate as indices on which big historical events are hung in Bengali language popular consciousness. So currently I'm reading the story of Shokina and Firoz, which tells the tale of the Mughal conquest of an area called Jongolbari in what was then, I guess, the periphery of the Mughal world. So it dates to, the events narrated in the story date to about 1660s. And the narrative itself was actually recorded both orally and also in written form in the early 20th century, when that sort of folk moment happens in response to, Greyson's linguistic survey, etc. There's a real collection of the folk tales and folk stories. So this narrative has been collected again and again and again throughout the 20th century, and it actually stays quite stable. It's a ballad that, I guess, there's no pre-text, there's no textual original text that can be found for it. It is the provenance for it, or the dating of when it was actually penned, is completely uncertain, but various people have said, late 18th century, perhaps early 19th century is when it is dated. So via texts like this, which often are actually situated in South Asia, I'm trying to see whether there is some way of actually naming something of these other chronologies, these other temporalities that I believe I actually already used in order to write the last book, but it's become quite urgent to be able to name them and theorize them. And just briefly, in the Moymanshing corpus that I'm using, thus far at this very early stage, what I can see happening in them is a real tension between I'm seeing gendered narrative storytelling happening, but that might just be because that's the perspective I'm looking from. There's a very big tension between sort of Mughal chronological history, which is matching up to, say, the Akbarnama, the various different other chronicles that will mention Jongolbari, will mention these areas that are sort of brought into the Mughal fold in the 17th century, sorry. And there's a tension between that kind of narrative and the narrative storytelling that is emerging from the Antar Mahal, so the love story. So what I'm finding is that the river of love, the Premer Nodi in Bangla, or the river, is something that is appearing again and again and again in the sort of theorization of how the chronologies of these stories operate. Now, this could just be because it's Bengal and it's a delta. Perhaps this has not much to do with Muslim storytelling or temporalities of historical narrative in Muslim historiography. However, I'm finding that the river and thinking with the river and through the river and the metaphors of the river are one of the key, or proving to be one of the most interesting places to go with this. So I would just like to end with just returning to the image of those young Muslim girls at the protest at Hyde Park. this question of, can they actually bring other temporalities to Hyde Park? Are there other axes along which we can envision better futures, different temporalities to progress? In some ways, the answer to that question lies in the hands of the educators that these young people have access to. I don't know. Some of these young hijabi women might end up in my classroom, in my gender studies classroom. And then it becomes actually a question of, what is it, how is it that you teach them? How is it that you narrate and name these alternatives that are actually available? So I hope I've given you some insight into what's at political stake currently, working from Britain in thinking about South Asian texts and temporalities in some of the ways that I've discussed today. And yeah, I guess I would just like to bring to an end with the insistence that if historians played a key role in the institution of colonial time, historians have a key role to play today in dismantling it. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that really, really very thought-provoking, stimulating, scintillating talk. Really enjoyed it, thinking hard, trying to bring these very, very suggestive themes that you've brought together here. I'd like to start by talking, I mean, I have a couple of questions. This very, very resonant theme recently also, Priya Satya, as you must know, has written Time's Monster, which is once again about, these historicism. There you go. Yeah. The question of historicism, which of course has been a question that post-colonial thinkers or decolonial thinkers talk about a great deal. And yours is a very interesting take within that. One of the, in terms of what do you leave, again, very, very suggestive and very, very important question of the grammar of hope, because, progress or historicism, what it has done is that it has tied hope to historical time. Yeah. In fact, the idea in terms of its origins, the idea of progress emerges from precisely these Christian eschatology debates within Christian Protestant eschatology. So it's closely tied into the idea of salvation, of historical salvation. Of course, one of the big thinkers in the middle of the 20th century, also post-colonial, I think we should think of the Jews in Europe as a post-colonial people, Walter Benjamin, who, of course, was attacked historicism. That was a major part of what he was trying to do in the theses on the philosophy of history, or on the concept of history as it's known. And as you know, Benjamin, so in terms of imagining other grammars of hope, his was this idea of now time on the one hand, and which is tied into the idea of messianic time, or messianic, the messianic presence in any given moment, the possibility of the eruption of the Messiah at any given moment. So that's one way in which he has addressed this. The question for me, because, I've thought more and more that it seems that people of the past could live without historical hope, because their idea, for people of the past, this world was not something to attach hope with, because the world was transient, life was transient. So people, when they thought of hope, or that's at least what wise people, the sapiential tradition tried to teach them, is to detach from this world. Even in Islam, You have all these injunctions, I mean, from Imam Ali and throughout Sufism, that one should detach. This world has no reality; it's only relatively real at best. And any hope that you might have, you should attach to the vertical dimension, to the afterlife. Yeah. So my first question to you is, why do we need historical hope? Yeah. What is it? Because I've found myself in these academic situations where I'm always asked this question. I'm very, very personally not like you, not invested in this historicism, not invested in the ideology of progress, and we must find ways of getting out of it, because it's a racist, white supremacist idea. The idea of progress is a white supremacist idea. So if we are going to, like people of the past, they either, whether it was karma or whether it was the afterlife, the question of salvation was not for this life or for this world. It was for the afterlife, whether it was through reincarnation or getting, or moksha, or the afterlife itself, yeah, the akhirah. So why do we need? So that's my first question to you. Do we need historical hope? Yeah, do we need hope for this world? Yeah, I think because the reason I ask that is that it seems to me to put one's hope in something that is likely to be disappointed. So what if it is disappointed? Yeah, what if we have fascism as is happening, and it seems to be happening on a much, much larger scale than happened the last time around. Now it's all across the planet. It's not just in a few states. So what if we are looking at a very, very dark future? What if that, because the problem is that the idea of progress and the idea of historical hope is so closely tied in to how this system justifies itself, or how the world, this form of life, this historicist form of life that we live, this is how it justifies itself. So that's my first question to you. Thank you for that really stimulating.
Thank you so much for that very, very, very difficult question. I guess as an educator, when young people are in my classrooms in a heightened state of awareness about climate crisis, about a heightened state of awareness about where they are currently situated, I don't think we need historicist hope. I do, however, think we need hope. I do, however, think we need ways of giving people the capacity to be able to see a future, and a future that is not necessarily death. Or perhaps that means to rethink death profoundly. Perhaps that means a very, very, very profound rethinking of life, the border between life and death. I guess these are young people who, it's a very different question to when I was teaching in Bangladesh, because these are young people in the SOAS context where a lot of them are going to be in positions of power. A lot of them are going to be in positions of institutional power. A lot of them belong to the Global South elite. A lot of them belong to the British elite. A lot of them are going to set the terms for how activists imagine the future. So whether it's hope or not, this world of activism, this world of imagining the future, I think that a really important intervention needs to be made there. We need hope, because how else can you act? Surely we need hope, because how else can you do with some sort of conviction that it leads somewhere? But I may be being too modernist in my particular mode of thinking here. And your question just gets to, I mean, it's just a very, very, very challenging, very difficult question. I expected nothing less. But it gets me to thinking about resilience in some ways. Perhaps the, salvation, if salvation is not what we're seeking, because I very clearly hear your drawing a genealogy between this particular type of discourse of salvation that is in that kind of messianic progress narrative, and in some ways Marxist narratives of march to socialism actually follow the Jewish messianic tradition in many ways, as Walter Benjamin and others have thought through. If we can get rid of this notion of we're going to arrive at a destination point, but yet and transform that to a focus on the path of getting there, that is what I'm interested in. I'm not actually interested in telling my students about salvation or teaching them to see salvation, but this sense of being able to get through this moment, working towards something better. That is something that I'm politically very, 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 very committed to. And I think the shift from historicist hope to another kind of grammar of betterment or grammar of futurity is that shift from the destination point to the path, to the pathway. So in some ways, we will fight today in the hope that tomorrow we will fight again, in the hope that tomorrow we will fight again, rather than we will arrive at this particular juncture. I don't know whether that answers your question. I guess hope is one of those ones. I'm not willing to I'm letting go of a lot of things: progress, modern subjectivity, modernity, one by one, recognizing just how implicated they are in colonialism and colonial epistemic violence. Yet hope, dreams are not ones that...
I'm not suggesting that we can do without hope. We need hope. I'm just asking, do we need historical hope? I mean, because there's this vertical hope, which depends upon, okay, you do what is ultimately significant now. Yeah. That means having acting with akhira in view.
Yeah.
Acting that what you do now is in fact important for all of eternity. Yeah. So that's the hope. The hope is in the vertical dimension, and which is in the afterlife. The afterlife is here now.
Yeah. You've pointed to the incredible need at the moment to disentangle, of course, historical hope with hope itself. And we're straining for language even to be able to describe this other kind of hope. I mean, you've just named a couple of things, and I guess I'm straining for language because...
Me too, yeah, absolutely. These are really tough questions. These are the essential questions.
Yeah. But the other thing that your comment made me realize is one of these things that I keep thinking about every now and again is this notion of salvation, or this notion of the afterlife, and particularly this notion of Judgment Day that belongs to the Abrahamic faiths, how deeply connected that is to this project of history from below. Because this notion that there is a Judgment Day actually belies this idea that somewhere there is this record of every single thing that every single tiny small person is ever doing. And that actually is what underpins this very project of histories from below, histories from, the Haitian Revolution, that these people mattered, they belong on a register and a record somewhere. Is that notion actually separable from that idea of Judgment Day and that particular idea that the people of the book sort of structure their narrative storytelling about is another one that I think anyone who's practicing this history from below stuff as I am really has to perhaps think through. So thank you for such incredible comments. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Sajjad?
Yes, thanks. That's been really, really interesting. And just to make kind of a couple of observations first with what you've said. I mean, I totally take the point about the, I guess, the colonial habitus of language. We have certain restraints in the way in which we talk about things, in the way in which we would talk about history, about religion, about hope, about the future. All of these come out of certain modes and epistemologies that we've very much inherited, regardless, in fact, of where we're from. But alongside that, I think I'm very minded of what you've said about, just as historians were deeply implicated in the construction of coloniality, historians have to be very much at the forefront of decoloniality. And this whole, this classical question of the relationship between the scholar and the activist, which all of us, have to deal with. And the fact that there is a lot of pushback on that in all sorts of contexts. Almost every field of the humanities is having some sort of debate, which is pretty much about that. And even this, I guess this question of, which I remember being asked by one of my teachers when I was a sixth form, how can a believer be a historian? How can a faith-based perspective be at all compatible with the historical method, which in that case was coming from a Marxist perspective, but it's one which one encounters all the time in the academic field of history. How do you reconcile, I guess, what you might call enchanted, ontologies of temporality, as you called it, which are multiple, against a linear kind of chronological development of history, which has to be grounded in some sort of factuality, when one realizes that the factuality in itself is not that straightforward as it pretends often to be. So thank you. I think those are both really, really useful. Coming back, I guess, to this kind of theme of history from below, but also maybe even history from above and how they seem to come together. What struck me in the example that you gave of this text, and the metaphor of the pen, and also the metaphor of the diving for pearls, it brought me to this idea, which you find is especially true of poetry, I would say, not just in Bangla and in the Bengali context, but I would say this is true of Persianate poetry. If we're going to use the term Persianate, let's just use it for a while, because I know this is true of say, Persian and Urdu and other languages in Central Asia. You have this connection, I guess, between these four concepts that you mentioned: subjectivity, writing, history, performance, right? And a mapping of the way in which humans do this with how God does this, right? And so, this writing, this performance of this particular individual writing this work of poetry, which is marked by a title which is basically a universal history. I mean, the whole idea of stories of prophets is a universal history. That's the whole point of it, right? Is very much linked to this whole notion of how God kind of inscribes history, or inscribes the world, and creates the cosmos, and in a sense performs. I mean, again, linking it to the Abrahamic and the Vedic. I mean, God performs not just by uttering a letter or inscribing a pen, but of course in the Vedic traditions through dancing, right? The creative dance, or the destructive dance of the cosmos. So that particular parallel, which is very clear to me, which you find in so many forms of historical writing, and also particularly of poetry in a pre-modern Muslim context, that seems to be precisely what is so dissonant with the way in which history is actually practiced now. And I guess the question there is, how do you get historians to pay attention to that? How do you get historians to even recognize that as history? Because this is the problem we have. We've got to the point where for example, people working at early Islam are getting to the position where they're saying, well, should we even call this stuff history? Do we use some other word? How do we deal with these universal histories? How do we deal with these Persianate chronologies, etc.? I mean, in what sense are these even history? And is it the case then that it is the colonial state of mind or colonial practice which is producing or creating history for the first time? You have similar kinds of reflections on, whether ancient India had history, precisely in this way, because of the inability to recognize these sorts of modes of temporality and subjectivity that you find in texts, where, as you've said very clearly, they're entirely comfortable with multiple temporalities existing side by side, because they're entirely comfortable with the idea that reality is not just what you can feel and touch right in front of your face. Right? And that seems to me the fundamental difficulty with this kind of, very creative and different way of looking at history.
Yeah, so many thoughts there to jump off from. To start with, this question of how can you be a believer and a historian? I think the best way to answer that to anyone who poses that question is to flip it and to say, look at the terrains of thought that you can traverse if you believe things. Like, if the moment that I believe whatever it is search for, I will find, it's that when Munshi Razaullah shows me that that's the thing, he says, I've tied my lungi to my waist, I believed this and I jumped in. The moment that I believe that, this range of things, these possibilities open up. Questions that are not able to be asked if you don't believe that. You can't ask, were women traveling around, unless you're willing to just submit to that belief. So that performance of the terrains of human consciousness that become available to you when you believe in these particular things that paradigms of thought ask you to believe. I think that is sort of the only way, which gets us to how do you get historians to pay attention, my strategy so far. And I think it's a very costly strategy in terms of time, but it's also the only strategy I know, is to be a good storyteller. I find that I'm able to hypnotize people into getting drawn into the logics that I'm trying to show them, rather than tell them that this is a logic that exists. For me to be able to show them through 7-8 years of research, of searching for a subject, then for me to be able to show them, wow, look at this. My great-grandfather was actually heard his father read this text. His father reading this text sparked for my great-grandfather the desire to want to learn his alif bet se, his gog ho. And 150 years later, exactly the same has happened to me. So that kind of appeal to truth via performing the ongoing livingness of this epistemology, I think can almost be done via storytelling, only storytelling. And I've found that even the most hardened Australian historian cannot help but be seduced by the beauty of the narrative symmetry of it. Now, what that means then is the discipline required to produce a narrative that fits. I knew as soon as I saw, or not as soon as I saw, but once I understood what Munshi Razaullah was doing in inventing himself, I knew that the end of my book had to be about inventing a self, because that was the only way in which I could demonstrate and perform the ongoing operation of these paradigms. Now, one of the other things that, as you were talking, I was thinking about is I'm wondering whether even this even the very fact that progress has put in a unitary channel all these different political projects and modes of thinking about different histories has all been put into the unitary channel of progress in a way. In some ways, perhaps it's the wrong thing to be seeking a name for an equivalent to progress, because in doing that, I'm already seeking for a unitary philosophy of temporality. But I don't know how to communicate to my students the possibility of other things apart from progress without naming it. But I guess hearing you speak, I wondered whether it only comes into the realm of facticity in the historical discipline if and when I'm able to name it and go, look, isn't it similar to but different from progress? Which in itself just means that you can't, you're trying to make it legible to the historians. I guess in the end, it comes back to, for me, this kind of history writing very much currently is about the students, is about, I see young Muslims in my classroom who are hungry to be able to access these ontologies and have access to ways of creating selves that are not defined by modern institutions. So this being able to almost seduce people into seeing the range of things that become open to them, the fact that the entire archive of human histories of ontology actually become available to you the moment you step outside history's demands and rigid rules, I think is the best tool that I have at hand currently to convince historians. And it's, I mean, I don't know to what extent it's working. I know that when I go and speak at history gatherings and disciplines, people are like, we're into the kind of history you want to do. We're totally and utterly on board with this method of historical narrative that you're doing. What I'm finding harder is not convincing them that this is, you know, an incredibly expansive way of opening up human imaginations. What I'm finding harder is actually teaching students how to do it. Or I don't know, I've gone and written this thing. I know this thing works. I know I can do this. How do you next teach the next generation of young people to do it? That one I'm not entirely sure of. But as someone like you who would have this incredible level of knowledge about pedagogical spaces in which these kinds of knowledges were transmitted, you must have quite a lot of detail about how you do transmit this. Yeah.
Well, we can come back to that. I mean, I think in the, again, in the kind of the Persianate or the South Asian Persian context, one of the key ways in which this was done was partly through acts of reading some of these ballads as you refer to them, as well as for example reading Sadi, right? Mm-hmm. So Sadi's kind of ethical tales of in the Bostan and the Gulistan, which are very much kind of the core of education, the education of a person. They were there to precisely give you this idea that storytelling was partly about this creative imagination that you've talked about. I mean, the creative imagination is precisely, one of the central concepts in Sufism anyway. But also this notion that by kind of rehearsing and understanding these stories, which work, of course, at many different levels, they're very multivalent kind of stories, that helps you realize certain trajectories of what it means to be human. And that's where the possibilities arise. And so, I don't think that in those cases, they were terribly concerned with whether you described these works as history or not. These were very much about this category of the human, in the same way that the Tarikh literature did it, in the same way that the Akhlaq literature also spoke to this question of what it meant to be human. And of course, that's precisely the point of philosophy as well. So in that sense, there were clearly kind of other kinds of genealogies of texts which people were reading. But I do take your sort of central point, which is that you can't just displace progress and historicism and not replace it with anything. And that's, I think, precisely, I mean, I was just teaching this week. we just started a class on decolonial Islamic studies, and you know, the whole difference between post-colonial and decolonial, as far as I understand it, is that you've got to go beyond the critique. Yeah. You've got to actually then say what the options and the futures are. So it's not just about saying, well, coloniality is bad. Yes, we know it's bad. And you can give all this kind of litany of problems, both kind of historical and epistemological. But then what do you replace it with? What sorts of modes of thinking, epistemologies, praxis, do you actually replace it with? And that's, I think, the key kind of issue. But I still, I mean, I'm assuming, you know, just as a side kind of comment, you must have had some very interesting pushback from Australian historians. Yeah. Most historians tend to be pretty conservative. I mean, at least the ones I know in a lot of departments in Britain are not going to be very open to this sort of.
Well, the interesting or not interesting thing about Australian history scene is that I think I'm like the only brown person that's ever talked in the scene of Australian history. So there's this really sort of, in many ways, very stifling way in which no one ever challenges me. Because there's sort of this understanding that, oh, we've got an actual Muslim talking about actual Muslims. So whatever she says must be right. Now, so
they don't want to be accused of being racist.
Yeah, so I mean, it's intellectually a very, 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 in that way, quite a non-grow. It's not a space in which you can grow. Like, it's a place where after I left Australia is when people started challenging me and going, this is rubbish, Samia, or this works, this doesn't. So in the Australian history scene, because I have to say the Australian history scene has been very, very, very open to this book in many ways, because there's a very strong culture of cultural history writing. So investing in the sort of narrative aspects of historical storytelling is something that they absolutely love. And also in the Australian context, very different to the British context, you can walk into the University of Sydney and you can say, without being controversial, that when the foundation stone for the University of Sydney is laid in 1857, it's an assertion of the superiority of colonial modern ways of thinking, and it effaces Aboriginal epistemologies. So there's an understanding that the entire edifice of Australia is built on this other epistemic ground. Now, we don't have that in Britain. You can't point to that in Britain as a moral and political reason for which we must be open to other epistemologies. So in Britain, I think it's probably a lot harder than in settler colonial context, but you can always point to that. We are on Indigenous ground, and so this entire edifice of thought is on flimsy, you know, on very flimsy ground. But also, do we need to convince the historians? Is it, I guess I wonder whether, particularly in the context of SOAS, what I'm really interested in is the SOAS library has like 1 million of these texts that these students should be reading, not as dead objects, but in order to see what kind of subjectivities they can cultivate for themselves and for their communities, their worlds. And so to me, the student, I guess the SOAS student body is such, and that SOAS library is such a powerful one that has all those texts that have been dedified. It the task becomes principally about them. And if the historical establishment sort of just doesn't know what to do, the biggest critique I get from the historical establishment, and it's happened in the States, is people will say, aren't you just the same as the Orientalists? How is what you're doing at all different to Orientalist thinkers? In, you know, the classic European colonial Orientalists who are reading these texts and falling in love with them at times. How is what you're doing different? And, you know, to answer back, it's always, I always either highlight the particular anti-imperial political project with which I'm reading texts, but even then, you know, that doesn't sometimes satisfy. But then I will say, people, to read a text, to actually completely transform yourself, to be open to texts so that you are not, in your reading in them, enacting your own epistemological superiority. The project to actually invent a subject that is different to the enlightened man who has mastery over a text, that project is definitely one I do not share with, you know, the Orientalists. But yeah, it is one that I get again and again and again, but usually with a real smile, because particularly if I'm able to perform the narrative storytelling in a way that, you know, charms people into the beauty of the narrative, even the critiques tend to come with, no one thus far has looked at my work and gone, this is really dangerous. this cannot be allowed into the realms of history. They've gone, oh, Samia's a bit random, she's doing some interesting random stuff. Oh, you know, so it'll be patronizing as opposed to kind of, yeah.
But, you know, in a sense, it would only be like an Orientalist project if you were replacing progress with something which was definitive, which would then become the kind of the master narrative of how you do history. And that's not what you're doing. So, and again, that's not how I see decolonial futures working out as well. It's not about replacing one kind of master narrative with another one, but rather thinking about how you pluralize that and thinking.
Yeah, but I think you're right in that the moment, if I or someone else was to theorize this mode and insist on it being taught, the moment that you might try and hook this kind of type of historical thinking to institutional power, that's the moment that it would raise alarm bells, I think. Because modern institutions just, it fundamentally goes against the secularism of particular types of spaces that structure modern power today. But I guess I'm not powerful enough to be able to do that kind of thing. And I'm not that interested in becoming powerful.
Well, but this is, I think this is precisely why, I mean, you mentioned why Halak, this is why people are uncomfortable with Halak's project, because Halak's project goes to the very core of saying, so what is a university for, right? What is knowledge for? Why are we doing this? And he's kind of trying to orient it in a much more ethical direction, which of course I would say is very compatible with Saadi and with Hafez and with Jami and, you know, all the kind of major figures of the Persianate canon in some ways. And that's where people do get worried, because once you start questioning, you know, how hierarchies work within universities, how do different languages, different disciplines relate to each other? How do we define history as a discipline which has a presence as a department and certain faculties and so forth? That's when it becomes a bit more kind of problematic. I totally take that.
Can I take up another theme, if I may? I know we're a little late, but I can't resist. There's this other very, very interesting theme that Samia brought up. Two themes actually kind of related to each other, which is the theme of the pen. And also related to that, the theme of love, the river of love, as you were saying. Now, the interesting thing, of course, is the pen in the ocean, of course, immediately reminds you of that famous ayat from Surah Luqman. If all the trees were pens and all the oceans were ink, that would not be enough to articulate the kalamat, the sayings of God. Yeah. So there's this very it's a remarkable. Not only is that remarkable, but the very idea, in Islam, that the pen actually precedes creation, which means all of creation and all of existence is writing, is articulation. Creation is articulation. And this is why people of the past, as Foucault, for instance, pointed out, they thought of the universal words and things when they were actually had a connection. Things themselves were spoke, and I don't think there's such a marked difference between speaking and writing. In fact, all speaking is writing, and all writing. Both of them are forms of they are articulation. Writing is articulation, speaking is articulation, and creation, which is formation. Now, the remarkable thing, I'm just riffing, because it's so suggestive, that the word for writing, talif, has the same root as the word for love, which is ulfat. Both of them come from the same root. This occurred to me when this very famous, probably one of the most famous shairs from Khalid, who said, "Talif e nuskha hai wafa kar raha tha main," which means I was talif, which means writing. I was writing the prescriptions of faith. Because when you're writing, you're bringing together your different commitments. Which is your what you believe in, your faith. Talif e nuskha hai wafa kar raha tha main. I was writing, bringing together. Writing is bringing together, and also connoting love. We are bringing together my different commitments. Talif e nuskha hai wafa kar raha tha main. Majmua khayal abhi fard tha. My thoughts were disparate. So this is the moment of writing, is out of love, or all that you love, you bring it together. In the moment of writing. So writing and love are inextricable from each other. And love is articulation at the same time. So that's also a very, very suggestive part of your discourse on this text.
Yeah, I would love to run a course called The River of Love, or it's just the river stuff. The discourses on love are just so incredibly ripe for thinking in a gender studies classroom in particular. And what's absolutely fascinating to me is that as far as I can tell, that stuff, that relationship between the lover and the beloved, gender studies spaces have not thought using that hermeneutic. And I don't know why. I do know why. It's the profoundly modernist foundations of gender studies as a space and a discipline, but I guess the particular locus that I'm at now just is very, very, very ripe for bringing these things together. And so in that sense, to the people who are getting challenged and aren't liking what I'm doing is probably more in the gender studies scene, because that's currently where I'm situated. Perhaps the historians aren't critiquing because I've sort of slightly shifted out, just because I see these young people who can just very clearly see the fallacies and problems with the way that gender is being talked about, particularly at SOAS, because of the focus on Asia, Africa, and the Middle East. But it's, yeah, so much more thinking to be done about discourses of love. But you know, it's hard to get. It's sometimes hard to get people to take it seriously, or that, you know, that in the world of rationalist scholarship, it is difficult to say, actually what I wish to focus on for the next decade is the concept of the Premier Nodi, or the concept of the river of love, and how that is flowing through textual production, whether it's a mathematical treatise in Bengal, or but it's structuring so many different things. But I don't know, again, because I am in Bengal intellectually, textually, I can't tell whether the river of love focus is specifically about Bengal. Unfortunately, I don't have access to Urdu, and I don't have access to other languages to be able to quite yet work out whether that's across South Asia. Sorry, that was also some riffing.
I think you'll find it is very common across the region. And that's because I think it is linked to very well-known, not just vernacular traditions, but also Persian traditions. So, so like, you know, a friend and colleague, what's his name? At Chicago, I've forgotten his name now. Who does Bengali, but he also does Persian, and he's written about the translations of the Yusuf Zulaikha tradition into Bengali, and translations of Jami into Bengali, and so forth. And you find that with other kinds of vernaculars as well, in the way in which you have these resonances and ideas. And you find it in the Sufi romances. I mean, I've taught Mirmanchan's Madhu Malati for a number of years in first year class. You know, it's a really nice 16th century Sufi romance. And of course, in most cases, students find it very difficult to kind of get into, precisely because they're not used to even reading that sort of poetry at school. You know, we don't seem to do that sort of stuff anymore because of the way in which education has changed so dramatically, that they find it unfamiliar. And yet this is one of the great classics of South Asian literature, I would say. And it is you don't have to even read it to realize how familiar it is. So anyway, we haven't actually taken any of the questions from the chat, but there wasn't really, well, I mean, these things could take us into another hour. So we should probably not do that.
Fortunately, we need to close now. It's an hour.
Yeah, of course. I guess that just kind of leaves us to thank Samia for her wonderful talk, and I'm certainly hopeful that people will have a lot to think about and maybe to do, which arises out of it. And also, beyond thanking her, also to remind us all of our next seminar in the series, which is in a couple of weeks, at the same time, same place, same virtual space, which will be with Farah Mehla, my colleague at Exeter, who will be talking about Muslims in Sri Lanka after colonialism. So look forward to seeing you all then. But yeah, it's good evening from me. Thank you once again to Samia and to Norman, and to all of those of you who've been listening and thinking with us.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Bye bye. Allah Hafiz.
Allah Hafiz.